On October 15th, 1821, in the remote Yorkshire moorlands of northern England, Dr. Edmund Harwick arrived at Thornfield Private Asylum to examine a case that would challenge everything the medical establishment understood about human physiology and linguistics. Patient 47, as she was designated in the asylum's records, had been discovered 3 weeks prior, wandering the desolate moors in a state of apparent delirium, speaking in a language that no scholar could identify. The initial medical examination conducted by Dr. Harwick revealed no physical abnormalities. Her height, weight, and vital signs all fell within normal parameters for a girl of approximately 14 years. Yet when he placed his stethoscope against her skull, as was common practice in phrenological examination, he detected vibrations unlike anything documented in medical literature, oscillations that seemed to resonate at frequencies that made his instruments sing. But before we dive into this nightmare, if you're new here and love spine-chilling stories, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to be notified when the next one drops. Now let's begin. What happened next at Thornfield Asylum would fundamentally alter the understanding of human linguistic capability and challenge the very boundaries of what was considered physically possible. By October 22nd, Dr. Harwick had exhausted his own considerable expertise and summoned Professor Aldrich Pemberton from Oxford's Department of Comparative Philology, along with his colleague Dr. James Worthington, who had spent decades cataloguing Aboriginal languages across the British Empire. The two men arrived expecting to find perhaps a case of glossolalia or an obscure dialect from some remote corner of the world. But what they encountered in the cold stone chambers of Thornfield defied all rational explanation. Patient 47 sat perfectly still in her cell, her lips moving in patterns that produced sounds no human throat should have been capable of generating, not merely foreign phonemes, but acoustic phenomena that existed outside the established range of human vocalization. Professor Pemberton's initial transcription attempts failed catastrophically when he realized the girl was producing simultaneous multitonal frequencies, creating harmonics that resonated at 17,000 hertz and above, well beyond the normal human capacity of 4,000 hertz. Even more disturbing was Dr. Worthington's discovery, made while analyzing the wax cylinder recordings, that certain syllables contained infrasonic components below 20 hertz, frequencies that induced unexplained anxiety and nausea in anyone who listened to the playback. The mathematical analysis revealed something even more troubling. The syntactic structure of her utterances followed non-Euclidean geometric patterns, with nested recursive loops that created meaning through dimensional relationships rather than linear progression. Each phrase contained prime number sequences that, when mapped phonetically, produced calculations that wouldn't be formally recognized by mathematics for another century. The asylum staff began reporting disturbing phenomena in the days following the linguistic examination. Nurses complained of hearing the girl's voice echoing through walls when she wasn't speaking. Orderlies found themselves involuntarily mimicking fragments of her vocalizations, and Dr. Harwick documented in his journal that he had begun dreaming in geometric patterns that hurt to remember upon waking. The temperature in patient 47's cell consistently measured 5 degrees colder than the surrounding rooms, despite sharing the same heating system, and moisture would condense on the windows in elaborate crystalline patterns whenever she spoke for extended periods. Most alarming of all was the incident of October 28th, when night matron Elizabeth Crow was discovered in a catatonic state outside the girl's cell, her eyes rolled back, throat producing faint approximations of the impossible sounds, though subsequent medical examination revealed her larynx had somehow been restructured in ways that should have required surgical intervention. Professor Pemberton's final report, submitted to the Royal Medical Society but never published, concluded with a warning that would prove prophetic. This is not merely a case of an unknown language, but rather evidence of human interaction with a form of communication that originates from outside our understanding of physical reality itself. To understand the magnitude of what was unfolding at Thornfield, Dr. Harwick initiated an investigation into patient 47's origins that would uncover a pattern of disappearances stretching back centuries. The girl had been found near the ruins of Blackmore, a village that appeared on no contemporary map, though references to it existed in Yorkshire parish records, dating to the 15th century. When Harwick's assistant, Thomas Ashford, traveled to the site on November 3, 1821, he discovered not merely an abandoned settlement, but a place where abandonment itself seemed to have been sudden and absolute. Tables still set with pewter plates green with verdigris, clothes hanging on lines now rotted to threads, and most disturbing of all, a church whose records abruptly ceased mid-sentence on September 19, 1819, the final entry reading, "The stones sing tonight, and the children answer in tongues of," with the rest lost to an ink stain that looked deliberate rather than accidental. Local shepherds from neighboring valleys, when pressed with sufficient coin and whiskey, spoke reluctantly of lights that had danced above Blackmore for 3 nights before the village's disappearance, describing them as cold stars that moved against nature, and sounds that made the sheep birth dead lambs with too many eyes. The geological survey commissioned by Dr. Harwick revealed that Blackmore sat at the exact convergence of 3 pre-Christian stone circles, each one older than Stonehenge, according to the archaeological dating methods available, and each bearing carved symbols that Professor Pemberton recognized with growing alarm as bearing structural similarities to the notation system he had developed to transcribe patient 47's vocalizations. But what transformed scientific curiosity into genuine dread was Ashford's discovery in the restricted archives of York Minster Cathedral, a manuscript from 1348 describing a girl found after the Black Death had swept through the region, a child who spoke in the tongues of the spaces between heaven and earth, and whose presence preceded the complete disappearance of the monastery at Whitby. The medieval account, written by a monk named Brother Francis, described symptoms identical to those exhibited by patient 47, the impossible vocalizations, the temperature anomalies, and most tellingly, the way her speech seemed to unfold reality like a scroll being read backward. Even more disturbing were marginalia added by different hands over the centuries, each noting similar cases in 1423, 1571, and 1694, always young girls, always found near ancient stone sites, always speaking the same impossible language, and always preceding localized disappearances that official records either ignored or deliberately obscured. The Archbishop of York, when discreetly consulted, provided Dr. Harwick with access to sealed Vatican correspondence from 1572, warning of the recurring manifestation of the lingua praeter, the language beyond, and instruction that any such cases were to be contained through methods that must never be committed to writing, lest the knowledge itself become a doorway. The events of November 15, 1821, marked the beginning of what Dr. Harwick would later term the transformation episodes, phenomena so extraordinary that several witnesses would subsequently require commitment to asylums themselves. During what began as a routine morning examination, patient 47 entered a state that defied all medical understanding. Her pupils dilated until her eyes appeared entirely black. Her skin took on a translucent quality that allowed observers to see the shadowy movement of blood through subcutaneous vessels, and most impossibly, her hair began to move as if suspended in water, despite the still air of the examination room. The thermometer mounted on the wall, a precise German instrument that Dr. Harwick had imported at considerable expense, plummeted from 62 degrees Fahrenheit to 41 degrees in the span of 30 seconds, causing frost to form on the windows despite the coal brazier burning steadily in the corner. As the girl began to speak in her impossible language, the resonance of her vocalizations created standing waves visible in the dust motes, suspended in the morning light, geometric patterns that hurt to perceive directly, and 3 medical instruments, a brass sphygmomanometer, a percussion hammer, and most remarkably, a 200-pound examination table, began to move without any physical contact, sliding across the floor in patterns that corresponded to the rhythm of her utterances. The magnetic compass Dr. Harwick had been using to test electromagnetic theories spun wildly before its needle melted into a perfectly spherical droplet of iron that defied gravity by hovering 3 inches above its housing. Even more disturbing than these physical impossibilities were the shared visions experienced simultaneously by all 7 staff members present during the November 18th episode, each independently describing, before being allowed to confer, the same horrifying scenes. Vast spaces filled with architectural structures that followed no earthly geometry, cities built from materials that seemed both organic and crystalline, and most terrifyingly, things that moved between the buildings that it could not properly be called creatures, as they appeared to exist in more dimensions than human perception could process. Nurse Catherine Blackwood's testimony, recorded in Dr. Harwick's journal, described seeing mathematical equations hanging in the air like living things, writhing and breeding more complex theorems that made my eyes bleed to follow. while the orderly James Morrison reported that the walls became transparent, and I could see through them into spaces that weren't behind them, but rather beside them in directions that don't exist. The transformation episodes increased in both frequency and intensity throughout late November, with patient 47's body temperature dropping to levels that should have induced fatal hypothermia, yet seemed to cause her no distress, her heartbeat occasionally stopping for minutes at a time, while she continued speaking and moving normally. And on one particularly disturbing occasion, documented on November 24th, her shadow cast by the gas lamp moved independently of her body, assuming shapes that prompted Dr. Harwick to write. The shadow showed us what she truly was, and I fear that we are not observing a disturbed child, but rather something wearing the approximate shape of one. What makes this case particularly significant in the annals of linguistic archaeology was the breakthrough achieved by Professor Marcus Blackwood of Cambridge, a scholar whose expertise in dead languages had led him to study cuneiform tablets that the British Museum deemed too fragmentary for public display. Arriving at Thornfield on December 2nd, 1821, Professor Blackwood brought with him translation of Sumerian texts that predated the official historical record by thousands of years, tablets that spoke of words from before the first word, and the tongue that shaped reality from void. His methodology was unorthodox. Rather than attempting direct translation, he mapped the harmonic frequencies of patient 47's vocalizations against the mathematical relationships found in pre-Babylonian astronomical texts, discovering to his profound disquiet that certain phoneme clusters corresponded exactly to stellar positions that wouldn't be visible from Earth for another 3,000 years. The partial translation he achieved on December 7th revealed content that challenged the fundamental assumption that patient 47 was speaking about our reality at all. Her words described cities of living geometry suspended in spaces where light moved backward, landscapes where matter existed in states that violated conservation laws, and most disturbingly, detailed accounts of locations that existed between the seconds of time and in the angles that connect parallel line. The phrase that appeared most frequently in her utterances, which Blackwood translated as the spaces between, was accompanied by mathematical proofs demonstrating that three-dimensional space contained hidden folds accessible only through specific acoustic frequencies, frequencies that corresponded exactly to the impossible sounds the girl was producing. Even more alarming was her repeated references to those who wait, entities she described not as beings, but as thoughts that achieved independence from thinkers, existing in the mathematical foundations of reality itself, observing our world through every angle and waiting for the correct linguistic keys to grant them passage. Professor Blackwood's most disturbing discovery came when he realized that embedded within the syntactic structure of her language were mathematical equations that wouldn't be formally discovered until the 20th century. She was casually employing concepts equivalent to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, describing quantum mechanical principles that wouldn't be theorized for another 100 years, and most impossibly, providing solution to mathematical problems that Renaissance scholars had deemed unsolvable. The language itself appeared to predate not merely known human civilization, but possibly human evolution itself, containing linguistic fossils that suggested it had been spoken when the Earth's continental configurations were radically different, incorporating terms for geological features that had vanished beneath the oceans millions of years ago. Professor Blackwood's final translation session on December 11th ended abruptly when he succeeded in understanding a complete sentence, the content of which caused him to suffer a cerebral hemorrhage. His final words, recorded by Dr. Harwick, were, "She's not speaking about other places. She's speaking them into existence, and God help us, something on the other side is learning how to speak back." The situation at Thornfield Asylum became even more disturbing when on December 14th, 1821, 3 patients who had never come into direct contact with patient 47 began speaking fragments of her impossible language during their morning treatments. Mrs. Adelaide Thornton, committed for melancholia following her husband's death, suddenly ceased her usual weeping and produced a series of multitonal vocalizations that made the windows in Ward C vibrate at frequencies that turned the glass opaque. Thomas Hartley, a former soldier suffering from battle fatigue, was discovered standing rigid in his cell, his throat producing sounds that Dr. Harwick noted seemed to emerge from the walls themselves rather than his larynx. And most alarmingly, 8-year-old Elizabeth Ashworth, admitted for catalepsy, began writing equations in her own blood on the floor while chanting in harmonics that caused the gas lights throughout the entire wing to dim and brighten in nauseating patterns. The contagion, as the medical staff had begun calling it, despite no evidence of biological transmission, spread through the asylum's population with a selectivity that defied epidemiological models. It affected only those who had experienced severe psychological trauma, as if the fractures in their psyche provided entry points for whatever was propagating through the facility. By December 18th, the physical structure of Thornfield itself began showing signs of impossible alteration. Geometric patterns appeared burned into the stone walls wherever patient 47 had walked, designs that hurt to look at directly and seemed to extend into the stone at angles that suggested depth, where no depth should exist, creating optical illusions that several staff members claimed allowed them to see into adjacent rooms through solid walls. The temporal anomalies began subtly, pocket watches running backward, candles burning without consuming wax, and correspondence dated days in the future appearing in the Morning Post. But by December 20th, Dr. Harwick documented an incident where Nurse Margaret Fielding, aged 3 years, in the span of an afternoon, while standing guard outside patient 47's cell, her hair graying and skin wrinkling, while she insisted only minutes had passed. The disappearances started on December 22nd. First, the night orderly William Crane vanished between his 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. rounds, leaving behind only his uniform folded with impossible precision into geometric shapes that maintained their form despite having no visible means of support. Then Dr. Jonathan Mills, who had been studying the mathematical patterns, walked into a supply closet and never emerged, though his voice could be heard faintly through the walls for days afterward, counting prime numbers in a language that was becoming increasingly inhuman. On December 26th, Boxing Day, a contingent of men arrived from London wearing no official insignia, but carrying documents bearing the seal of the Crown's Special Advisory Committee, a governmental body whose existence was not publicly acknowledged, led by a Mr. Blackstone, who identified himself only as a specialist in contained phenomena, and immediately ordered the asylum sealed, with no one permitted to enter or leave until the situation could be properly classified and controlled through methods that fell outside conventional medical practice. The most disturbing aspect of all emerged on December 28th, when Father Antonio Torretti arrived from the Vatican, bearing sealed documents from the secret archives that had not been opened since 1672. Revealing that the Church had been documenting and suppressing identical cases for nearly 5 centuries. The records, written in ecclesiastical Latin with certain passages deliberately obscured, using a cipher known only to the Pope's private secretary, detailed the case of Sister Margarita of Avignon in 1348. A young novice who had begun speaking in the tongue of the void, following her discovery near a Roman temple foundation, producing vocalizations that caused spontaneous stigmata in those who listened, and geometric burns that appeared on sacred objects in her presence. Father Torretti's documents revealed that Pope Clement VI had established a secret ecclesiastical order, the Silentium Aeternum, specifically tasked with identifying and containing these manifestations, maintaining detailed records of 17 similar cases between 1348 and 1819. Each one preceded by the discovery of pre-Christian artifacts and followed by localized disappearances that church records officially attributed to plague, war, or natural disasters. The connection to forbidden texts became apparent when Father Torretti produced a partial copy of the Liber Vocis Alienae, written by the excommunicated scholar Brother Aldrich in 1423, who had attempted to create a comprehensive dictionary of the impossible language before his mysterious death, his body found turned inside out in a locked monastery cell, yet somehow still breathing for 3 days afterward. The Church's suppression methods, documented in a text titled Protocolla Continendi, included specific architectural requirements for containment chambers built using sacred geometry that created what they termed null spaces, areas where the laws of physical reality were reinforced through constant prayer and the strategic placement of blessed silver mirrors arranged in patterns that reflected sound back into itself until it ceased to exist. Most revealing was the Vatican's understanding of what they called contagion through comprehension, the terrifying principle that the language itself was not merely a means of communication, but a viral concept that spread through understanding. The more one comprehended its meaning, the more one's brain restructured itself to accommodate thoughts that human neurology was never meant to process. Cardinal Giuseppe Antonelli's secret correspondence from 1671 warned that the danger lies not in hearing the words, but in beginning to understand them. For comprehension opens doorways in the mind through which things that should not be can enter our world, and described cases where entire monasteries had to be sealed and burned after monks achieved partial translation, their enhanced understanding allowing them to perceive and interact with dimensions that overlapped our own. The protective rituals Father Torretti attempted at Thornfield, involving specific prayer cycles intoned at frequencies meant to counteract the girl's vocalizations, initially seemed to stabilize the situation until patient 47 began incorporating the Latin phrases into her own speech patterns, corrupting the sacred words into something that made blood seep from the eyes of Christ on Torretti's crucifix, and caused the communion wine in the Asylum's chapel to transmute into a substance that moved against gravity and whispered mathematical proofs when observed. On January 3rd, 1822, Dr. Edmund Harwick conducted what would become the final documented session with patient 47, a recording that survived only because his assistant had hidden the wax cylinders inside a lead-lined medical container that somehow insulated them from what followed. The transcript, when combined with Harwick's final journal entries, reveals a conversation that fundamentally challenged humanity's understanding of its place in the cosmic order, beginning when the girl, speaking for the first time in accented but clear English, stated, "You have studied me long enough, Doctor. It is time you understood what you have been observing." The transformation in her demeanor was immediate and terrifying. Gone was the confused, seemingly disturbed child, replaced by something that wore the shape of a young girl but spoke with the weight of eons, her voice carrying harmonics that made the recording equipment oscillate between functionality and mechanical impossibility. When Dr. Harwick asked her name, she responded first in her impossible language, a sound that when played back caused 3 researchers in 1923 to suffer immediate psychological breaks, before translating it as, "I am the echo of the first equation," the remainder when reality divided from possibility. And the moment she spoke these words in English, every mirror in Thornfield simultaneously cracked in perfect spirals. The asylum's foundations shifted 3 inches northward, despite no seismic activity, and 17 clocks throughout the building began running at different speeds, creating a temporal cacophony that made several staff members age or regress in isolated pockets of accelerated or reversed time. The revelation she provided about human perception was perhaps the most disturbing element of the entire case. Humanity, she explained through mathematics that hurt to contemplate, existed in a universe that was merely the shadow cast by true reality, a 3-dimensional cross-section of something infinitely more complex, and human consciousness was never meant to evolve to the point where it could perceive beyond these limitations. "You are the dreams of sleeping gods," she stated, "and your awakening was never part of the design." Her core message about humanity's purpose proved even more terrifying in its implications. Humans were not the intentional creation of any divine force, but rather an accidental byproduct of cosmic processes, a kind of reality cancer that had developed consciousness as a mutation, and our expanding awareness threatened to destabilize the mathematical foundations that kept dimensions separate, our very thoughts acting as erosion on the barriers between worlds. The complete translation of her final extended vocalization, achieved only when 3 linguists worked simultaneously while blood streamed from their ears, revealed that Earth existed at a dimensional intersection point, a cosmic flaw where multiple realities touched, and humanity's growing population and technological advancement were weakening these boundaries. When 8 billion minds dream at once, she prophesied, the weight of their consciousness will crack the shell of reality like an egg, and what hatches will remake existence in forms that mathematics cannot describe. The evacuation of Thornfield began at 4:17 a.m. on January 4th, when the building's geometry began to fail, corridors extending infinitely, rooms existing in the same space simultaneously, and the screams of patients and staff echoing from directions that didn't correspond to any architectural feature. The official record of what happened at Thornfield Private Asylum states that on January 4th, 1822, a fire caused by an overturned oil lamp destroyed the facility, claiming 37 lives, including patients and staff, a tragedy attributed to the building's aging timber construction and inadequate safety provisions. This fabrication, orchestrated by the Crown's Special Advisory Committee within hours of the evacuation, required the systematic alteration of county records, newspaper archives, and even private correspondence, with Mr. Blackstone's agents visiting every major publication in Yorkshire to ensure that pre-written accounts of the tragic fire replaced any mention of the true events. While the actual ruins of Thornfield were dynamited and burned until nothing remained but scorched earth that even today refuses to support vegetation. The 23 surviving witnesses were dispersed across the empire within a fortnight. Dr. Harwick was posted to a remote medical station in Tasmania, where he died 3 months later, under circumstances the Colonial Office deemed consistent with tropical disease, though his final letter spoke of still hearing her voice in the wind off the Tasman Sea. Nurse Catherine Blackwood was committed to Bethlehem Hospital under a diagnosis of acute hysteria, where she spent her remaining years drawing geometric patterns that the staff were instructed to burn immediately. Orderly James Morrison emigrated to Upper Canada, where he disappeared into the wilderness near Lake Superior, leaving behind a cabin whose walls were covered in equations written in what appeared to be his own frozen blood. The systematic suppression extended to physical evidence, with government agents confiscating all documentation, though Dr. Harwick had presciently hidden his personal journal and several wax cylinder recordings inside a false bottom trunk that he sent to his nephew in Scotland, with instructions that it remain sealed for 100 years, a collection that would eventually surface in an Edinburgh estate sale in 1923 before vanishing into the private archives of collectors who understood its significance. The long-term effects on those who had heard patient 47's language proved impossible to entirely suppress. 7 former Thornfield employees were documented in medical journals throughout the 1820s and 30s as suffering from acoustic hallucinations that caused them to speak in tongues during seizures, producing sounds that multiple physicians noted seemed to come from the walls around them rather than their throats. While 3 children born to nurses who had attended patient 47 displayed troubling abilities, including young Margaret Fielding, Jr., who at age 4 was found levitating 6 inches above her bed while reciting prime numbers in a language her mother recognized with terror. The formation of the Custodia Silentii, a secret society established by surviving government officials, physicians, and church authorities who had witnessed the Thornfield events, created a network dedicated to monitoring and suppressing similar manifestations, maintaining detailed records of suspected cases while developing containment protocols based on Father Toretti's partially successful methods. Their archives eventually including reports of comparable incidents in Prague, 1834, Calcutta, 1851, and Salem, 1878, each one featuring young girls speaking impossible languages near sites of ancient significance, each one ending in localized disappearances that official history forgot. The implications of the Thornfield incident remained buried in classified archives until May 2019, when an estate sale in Edinburgh uncovered a collection of wax cylinders and documentation that had somehow escaped the attention of the Custodia Silentii for nearly 2 centuries, purchased for £12 by a digital audio engineer named Sarah Chen, who thought she was acquiring Victorian-era musical recordings. The digital analysis she conducted at the University of Edinburgh's Sound Archive revealed something that 19th-century technology could never have detected. Layered within patient 47's vocalizations were frequencies extending far beyond human hearing, containing structured data patterns that resembled nothing so much as compressed digital information, despite predating the computer age by over a century, with certain segments appearing to encode complex mathematical algorithms that modern quantum computers recognized as solutions to problems in multidimensional topology. When Chen posted a 30-second sample online seeking linguistic assistance, the file was downloaded 47,000 times in 3 hours before being mysteriously deleted from every platform simultaneously, but not before neurologists at Johns Hopkins reported that 7 patients in their care, all teenage girls being treated for various dissociative disorders, had begun speaking in tongues identical to those in the recording, despite having no prior exposure to the material. The contemporary medical documentation has been deliberately suppressed, but leaked reports describe cases in psychiatric facilities across 12 countries where adolescent patients have spontaneously begun producing the same impossible vocalizations, with MRI scans showing their brain activity forming geometric patterns identical to those Dr. Harwick sketched in 1821, while their brain tissue itself appears to be restructuring into configurations that shouldn't be compatible with human consciousness. The connection to modern unexplained phenomena becomes even more disturbing when considering that areas where these new cases have emerged, Sedona, Arizona, Glastonbury, England, Mount Shasta, California, correspond exactly to locations where underground neutrino detectors have registered anomalous readings, suggesting that space-time itself has become unstable, with one classified report from CERN describing dimensional membrane fluctuations, consistent with theoretical models of reality intersection points. The search for patient 47's true fate has intensified following the discovery that she never died in the Thornfield incident. Genealogical DNA analysis of hair samples preserved in Dr. Harwick's collection match no known human population, containing genetic markers that suggest either extreme antiquity or, more impossibly, sequences that appear to have been artificially constructed using mathematical principles rather than biological evolution, leading some researchers to propose that patient 47 was not a disturbed girl at all, but something that had learned to approximate human form in order to serve as a transmission vector for the language itself. The danger of achieving full translation has become apparent through the case of Dr. Michael Brennan, the MIT linguist who in 2021 claimed to have decoded the complete meaning of patient 47's core message, only to be found 3 days later in his sealed office, his body intact but his consciousness apparently dispersed across probability space. Security footage showing him walking through walls before disappearing entirely, leaving behind only a warning written in his own hand. Do not seek to understand. Comprehension is the key that unlocks the door, and what waits beyond has been patient for so very long.